Hello and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. On September 12th, 2018, I released the episode of And the Runner-Up Is on the 1993 Best Picture race, where we discussed The Piano as the likely runner-up that lost Best Picture to Schindler's List. But on second thought, what if the runner-up was really The Remains of the Day? Hello, and welcome back to On Second Thought, a bonus series of And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about another Best Picture nominee that I did not cover as the runner-up on the regular show. And for 1993, the Best Picture winner, of course, was Schindler's List. I covered The Piano on the regular show as the runner-up, but today we are deciding maybe let's see if The Remains of the Day could have been the runner-up. You never know. And I'm excited to get into that discussion. And to join me, I have two fabulous returning guests who I'm very excited to have back on. My first guest, you heard talking with me about A Letter to Three Wives and the films of 1949, as well as an episode of On Second Thought about Lost in Translation. Writer for The Film Experience, host of the Sundays with Kate podcast. Please welcome back to the show, Murtada Elfadl.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me back. I feel like I'm becoming a regular.
You are.
I'm excited to be back and to talk about this movie with you.
Oh, yes. This is going to be fun, and I say that somewhat ironically considering the tenor of the movie, but still, very fun. And, of course, my other guest you heard on the episode of On Second Thought right after Lost in Translation, actually, which was on The Hours. You've seen her with Next Best Picture, In Their Own League, her own podcast, Petticoats and Poppies. Please welcome back Nicole Ackman.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited to talk about another movie with a lot of repressed emotions.
Yes, it is your brand.
It really is.
And I specifically remember also with that episode, it was a very gloomy day recording that here in Connecticut. It was just a rainy Saturday morning, and coincidentally enough, it just completely downpoured here in Connecticut. So
okay, that's very funny because we've got terrible weather here today in North Carolina. So, the weather is theming itself to our movie choice.
It truly could not be more appropriate for this film. We're talking about The Remains of the Day. So let's get into a summary. It is a period drama based on the novel of the same name by Kazuo Ishiguro. It tells the story of a butler, Mr. Stevens, serving under Lord Darlington in 1930s Britain. And we see the arrival of a new housekeeper, Miss Kenton, who develops feelings for Mr. Stevens, but Mr. Stevens is very stubbornly committed to his work and nothing else. Meanwhile, we have Lord Darlington, who is often entertaining several guests who are sympathetic to the Nazi Party, and Stevens kind of refuses to voice any sort of opinion on the matter, not really feeling like it's his place. And all the while, time passes, and the relationship between Stevens and Miss Kenton just becomes further complicated. And the film was directed by James Ivory and written by Ruth Prower Jabala. It stars Anthony Hopkins as Mr. Stevens, Emma Thompson as Miss Kenton, James Fox, Christopher Reeve, Peter Vaughan, Hugh Grant, Michael Lonsdale, and Tim Pigott-Smith. And The Remains of the Day made $23 million at the U.S. box office, and it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and it didn't win a single one of them. Whoops. So let's first go to Nicole here. I know this was a first-time watch for you. I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on The Remains of the Day.
Yeah, it's interesting. The early 90s are a pretty big period. That's a gap for me, which I guess I was born in 94, so maybe that is why.
Hmm.
But I was super excited to watch this for the first time because I'm a big Downton Abbey fan, and one of my favorite things on Downton Abbey is I think it's a very interesting relationships that they show between the people who work in the house and the people who own it, particularly with a character like the butler on Downton Abbey, who is called Mr. Carson, and how he also deals with this idea of kind of his duty to this household and this family versus what he personally wants. And that's something that I actually found even more fascinating than obviously there's this beautiful love story going on in this film. But I found even more interesting this idea of this man who kind of lets his duty overshadow everything in his life, from his own passion to even his principles, and how that kind of plays out, and how he is kind of put into a weird situation whenever this man that he shows such deference to and has kind of committed his life to serving his household turns out to not be a great guy, and what kind of weird moral conundrums that puts him in. So I was so impressed. I thought everything about it was great. The acting, the design, the script. I was so happy with this.
Well, that's good. Excellent. So how about you, Murtada?
Well, I'm a huge James Ivory and Ismail Merchant fan, and I love like all their movies. I think most for like they had such an amazing run in the 80s and 90s. Like anything, every movie they made in the 80s and 90s, for the most part, was pretty much a masterpiece. And this coming a year after my favorite of theirs, Howard's End, like the one-two punch of Howard's End and The Remains of the Day coming back to back is just so amazing in the early 90s. That I think was their heyday. I love this movie also because it's about the best kind of love story. It's about thwarted love. It's about a love that doesn't end happily. And in this case, it's about the love that doesn't even come out to express itself. But I also loved a lot of other things about it. I think the idea that's running through it that is never in the text of it, but it's definitely an idea that the movie brings out, is about these old worlds crumbling, and about how it has this reverence to old ways because it's of how it meticulously recreates the house and the servants, the house and the service, and sort of the tradition of the service and all of that. But it also has this thing where it recognizes that this is a world that needs to be dismantled, that these old power structures have to be dismantled, and that that's the only way that society can move forward. And in some instances, it's very obvious. They have Christopher Reeve as an American, the new world coming in and sort of becoming the new master. And he's the one with the ideas about changing the old British ways. And in other ways, it's just not at all apparent to us. It's just the subtext of everything that happens. And it's why I love this movie so much.
Excellent. Yes. So The Remains of the Day is a story that I was very familiar with before seeing the movie. I'd actually read the novel, and it really devastated me. It's just so gorgeously written, and it really dives deep into Mr. Stevens' internal feelings and thoughts, and I kind of struggled to see how they could possibly communicate that on film, well, without heavy narration. And to the film's credit, it does not resort to that. And then, watching the film for the first time, I honestly think that knowing what I was getting myself into, that this was going to be a story of a very, very, very repressed individual who barely is able to change his ways, I think that allowed me to enjoy the film even more, because I imagine if I wasn't aware of how it would go, maybe I might be a bit frustrated. Typically, I do love stories like this, kind of about unrequited love that aren't afraid to have a bit of a unhappy ending. So I would imagine I would have still loved it, but I don't know. I wonder how audience members and even Academy members felt at the time about it. Either way, though, I do love this film. I love the story. I think it's able to communicate so much, but specifically in what goes unsaid, ironically. Just the facial expressions, all the space between them, the little micro moments. You can tell that James Ivory put a lot of care into crafting this very difficult story to make it cinematic, but I think he just knocks it out of the park. And I really also think that this is Anthony Hopkins' best performance. And yes, we have the cultural cachet of Hannibal Lecter. Of course, that will always be his most iconic performance and a very deserved Oscar win. One of the best of all time. But I think The Remains of the Day is where he shows the extent of his abilities as an actor. And it's so difficult for actors to stand out while also showing this level of restraint that he does here and not displaying those outward emotions and going off on big monologues. But I think everything he does in this movie should be studied by young actors. I just think it's such an astonishing performance, just watching his face and how you can just feel the tightness in him. All those tiny little glimpses we get also where we see a little bit of life in him are so fascinating. Like that one point where he's with Miss Kenton and he sort of playfully looks at himself in the reflection of the little serving plate. I think those little moments reveal so much about who he could be if he didn't feel that sense of duty to his work. And I think that ultimately just gets in the way of him living his life. And it's so heartbreaking to witness that and to see him at the end having that little bit of hope and have that be taken away so quickly. I just think it's such a perfectly crafted arc for a character that doesn't change all that much when you really think about it. So all of this is to say, what did we think of Anthony Hopkins here? Because I clearly love it. Love that performance.
I mean, when you mentioned his performance in the Silence of the Lambs, this is sort of the flip side coin of that performance, because that one is so showy and in your face, and you know he's big, and you can't sort of not be mesmerized by him because he fills the screen. And here it's the opposite. He is so recessive. And I was reading about trivia about the movie, and in an interview that he gave, he said a butler sort of told him that a room is more empty when a butler is in it, and that was the way that he took that sentence as his guide into the performance. And I read that while I was watching it, and I was like, yeah, it's he totally does that, where like he is so into himself. He never shows anything. It's just a flutter here or there. But then there is something as a magnetic actor that you just can read everything into his face.
It is magnificent. And I think that these are some of the hardest types of performances for an actor to pull off, because in the hands of a lesser actor, this role could easily become just nothing and you would get no sense of character at all, because they really are like, he's able to give you so much with so little. Like you said, there's no big monologue really. There's no, he doesn't get the crying scene. Like, and I do think that part of how his character is built so well and how his performance works so well is that he has Emma Thompson to play off of. But I think that he's really just magnificent in this, and it's definitely my favorite Hopkins performance too. Like, I think that he perfectly captures also that kind of civility that I think was true of a butler of that time, and that kind of sense that he is this kind of last symbol of a dying world, in terms of the house that's filled with servants, and he would have been head of dozens and dozens of people, and now he's only has a handful. But I think that he really is astounding in this, and I wish that more people talked about this performance of his whenever they talk about him as Hannibal Lecter all the time.
Yeah, he's more than just Hannibal Lecter, guys. Also, he's more than just one of the two popes. Just saying. He had a lot of great performances in between that.
I love what Nicole said about playing off of Emma Thompson, because they made these movies in like a 3-year period, and they were released right after each other, this and Howard's End. And Howard's End is completely her movie. Mm-hmm. Like you watch that movie and you leave with Emma Thompson is the greatest actress ever. And then and he's there obviously to help her get that performance. She's the one who she plays off, and she sort of repays him the favor here, because this movie is about him, and it's a performance you leave with is definitely Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah. But yeah, let's talk about Emma Thompson too. I mean, so perfectly cast for this kind of role. She had just won her Oscar for working on a Merchant Ivory film, Howard's End. And she is just so well suited for these kinds of women who are sort of wise beyond their years almost, and just so ahead of their time, kind of forward thinking. And that's no different here. I mean, Miss Kenton, she might not be like that kind of well-educated sort of character you would see in a Jane Austen story or something like that. But I think she shows from very early on just a level of common sense and a level of compassion and empathy that is very much missing from Stevens. And we especially see that when Stevens' father, who also works at the manor, is clearly struggling to sort of fulfill his duties. And I love that first third of the film so much, because I think we as an audience become very easily invested in wanting to see his father get better and be able to keep up with his tasks, even though you know in the back of your mind that this is not going to end well. And while this is all happening, you also get the sense of the differences between these two characters, and how Miss Kenton is pointing out, like, hey, there's something wrong here, and Stevens is just so stubborn and refuses to even address the problem until it's too late. And that is just so beautifully able to set up the entire conflict of the film, and their two different philosophies in life, that I think that first third really works and draws you in more than I remembered it doing.
I think the first third so perfectly sets up every conflict that comes later in the movie, because you do get to see very much kind of the ideology and how both of these two kind of opposing figures of Mr. Stevens and Miss Kenton behave, and how they treat people and how they interact with people and what they value. I think it sets up their values really well. And I think that without all of that happening, what happens afterwards wouldn't hurt nearly as much. But that you get that little bit of them kind of growing together, them growing to understand each other, and also him starting to see that, yeah, maybe her point of view has a point to it, you know, that what he has sacrificed to maintain who he is. I also I love Emma Thompson so much. She's one of my favorite actresses of all time. I think that, you know, we like to talk a lot about whenever an actor has like a great year, like everyone last year was talking about Adam Driver having this fantastic year. And 1993 is the year of Emma Thompson. Mm-hmm. She's got In the Name of the Father, and she's got Much Ado About Nothing. And 3 fantastic performances. And this one I think is actually one of the more interesting ones, in that it is maybe the more difficult character in terms of getting her being able to get across to us who this character is, because I do think that she's maybe the least straightforward character of the 3 that she plays in 1993. And I think that she really does do a great job of kind of providing a foil to Anthony Hopkins as Mr. Stevens.
I mean, I love it's the first third of this film. I love it because it's like the comedy part of the film, right? Because they're so passive aggressive against each other. They never say what they want from each other, which they don't do in the whole of the movie. But I think in the first third, it has a little bit more vigor. Like, she's so mad at him, and she can't even hide how mad she is. But at the same time, she can't say anything. So it's just her telling him, well, go look at that thing that happened. It's so passive aggressive.
It feels almost like a rom-com.
Yeah.
It was just so fun to watch. And you're like, well, obviously you love him. That's why you're so mad at him. And the same for him.
Yes, that's that is weirdly its own version of a rom-com situation, like a little meet cute almost. And then just going to the section where it seems like Stevens likes this newer maid, Lizzie, played by Lena Headey, by the way.
I was not ready for her to show up.
Yep. I really love that part as well, and Stevens and Miss Kenton just sort of subtly teasing each other once again, and then all of that leading up to when Miss Kenton catches him reading a romance novel, and they have that brief little moment where they're so close to each other, dangerously close. I think that's such a well done sequence of just that, like, there was your moment right there. And
Right.
it's just like, ugh, you couldn't stick the landing.
And of course, he has to say that he's reading the romance novel because he is advancing his education of the English language. Like,
Yes.
come on, Mr. Stevens.
Like, what a terrible excuse, honestly.
It's pretty lame.
But what I loved about that part of the movie is that if we had the rom-com passive aggressiveness in the first third, in this part of the movie, it's more of like two adults learning to admire each other and sort of in subtle ways show their love and admiration for each other, because they both do it. And it's very, very subtle and it's beautiful to see. She's obviously, Emma Thompson as Miss Kenton is more expressive about it and he is more reticent. But it is sort of a lovely romance of two adults, two grown-ups, two older people coming together.
It does feel like in the first third, you could say that they're, kind of enemies. And in the second third of it, they become friends and they're able to, interact with each other and amiably. And you do kind of get to see them grow into that, more of that relationship. And it is interesting because I do think that if this movie has a flaw, one of them is that it doesn't do a great job of showing the passing of time. Because there would be like certain things where it's like, well, I've been in this house for this many years. And I was like, wait, I'm sorry, what? Like,
Yeah. But hey,
so
maybe that's the point. Maybe it's just like, suddenly time is going by so fast and before you know it, here we are 20 years later.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I really enjoyed the middle third section of this movie before you kind of get dragged down into the gloominess of the last part.
The brutal last third, yes. Yeah. But one big part of this, especially in the first 2/3, is just the stuff with Lord Darlington, which I think is super fascinating. That I think really covers, I guess, just the perils of civility and respectability, when it means that you're also covering up some really insidious ideas and looking the other way. I mean, someone like Stevens can have this belief system of duty and honor and valuing that above anything else, all he wants. But doing that also means, having your lord becoming associated with fascists who want to eradicate a whole population of people. And there is that moment where Darlington wants Stevens to fire the 2 Jewish workers that work there. And Stevens puts up a kind of tiny little fight, but not that much. He ultimately just goes along with it, even though they've done nothing wrong. And you also have that scene where the Christopher Reeve character, I think he's a congressman, standing up at dinner and saying that everyone here is amateurs, just the way they're talking about these ideas and how they're only helping to just further spread this hateful movement, and then Darlington and his group find this more offensive than any of the ideas that they're talking about that are related to the Nazi party. I think all of that just says that right there, because you can be nice and civil and honorable all you want, but you have to recognize when you are in way over your head, as Darlington is here, and being manipulated by these forces that are spreading evil, and you can dress it up however way you want, but that's what's happening here. And I think that's a really interesting thing that is explored in the undercurrent here. Thank you for listening to this preview of On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes, a Slack channel, and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.